There's a reason why they
He does simple.
Maybe when you see this is still.
the other side.
I wonder if I can send a
I wish they could take us closer to Ibrahim.
Yeah, so
To see the whole stage.
you see that screen? I think, so the one I saw with Prof. Anidoho,
No, Mr. Adam has not put them on. Oh, so
Yeah, they're both on now. So just in case one doesn't.
let it be for you. To clean as well.
Yeah, there's one thing I do.
No, it's cool, it's cool.
Before you still
It's cool, don't worry. If you have done that, so we only need one mic.
Just in case.
Hello, good evening. Hello. Hello. Okay, I think. Hello. I'll use my mouth. I'll just talk. As you can hear, I want them to keep quiet, I think. Hello, good evening. Hi, if I may please have your attention. Hello, 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 hello. Hello, everyone. Those are the kitchen. Good evening, everyone. Whatever you're doing, if you can kindly round up because we want to begin the night session. And if you can keep your voices low for us so that we can have a great conversation. One love, Amma, can you hear me? Okay, I can read her lips, so. Hello, everyone. Good evening and welcome to Peja, a literary festival in Accra. This evening's session is a conversation between Wanlov the Kubolor and Ibrahim Mahama. It's a conversation titled Art on Edge, and we are honored to have Amma van Danzig to moderate the conversation. So with a round of applause, I would like to welcome on the stage Mr. Mahama.
Bonsu. I have to say, this is such a great joy for me. Can everyone hear me? Is Amma van Danzig. So I think there are no better people to have this conversation with about art on edge. What does that even mean? What does art on edge mean to you? Let's start with Ibrahim. Ibrahim, what does art on edge mean to you? And yeah, let's just start with setting the context. What does art on edge mean?
Anyway, thank you very much. Thank you to everyone for being here. And talk, and to Wanlov, my big brother, for always being so cheerful. Art on edge. Well, for me, a bit of my background, of course, I come from, I studied in Kumasi at the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology. Of course, the generation of caricature Seidu, who inherited the program, wanted to shift things within the department. So they started introducing us students to new forms of experimentations, because the curriculum which was there before didn't really allow for artists to really experiment and expand the parameters of what art could be. So you found that a lot of artists that were producing within a certain time period, from the, let's say, mid-20th century, even till the time that
that we became students, majority were still using the very traditional mediums of art and also traditional spaces of showing art. So it somehow left a lot out of the question when you're thinking about art in terms of what art really is within the 21st century, given all that we've inherited. There were so many limitations to it. So for some reason, I think we, at least I will speak for my generation, our generation, we're trying somehow to respond to it in a certain way. Black Star Lines, which is from the Department of Painting and Sculpture, has for many years been trying to organize exhibitions with students and other professionals alike, exhibitions which traditionally wouldn't happen. So if you're thinking about issues regarding the edge, of course also things like our professor friend caricature, encouraging students to somehow experiment with spaces which ordinarily you wouldn't think to work with, like going to the market to take the subject matter and the site and the space itself as a starting point to produce and then also to exhibit, in a way of changing the relationship between the art object that is made and also the site is coming from, and how it somehow it goes back into it. So it's almost like acting as if sometimes you're almost like a scientist in a way, trying to produce some kind of a virus and a vaccine at the same time in a way. So it's been quite interesting, and in ourselves we have Exit Frame, a group of collective, like a collective of artists who've been doing also really interesting things, also with regards to like experimenting with various pedagogical forms and all that, both from text to exhibitions and all that. Myself, I'm a member of the Black Star Lines collective. So as a student back in school, there was always a question that is it possible to expand the parameters of art experience beyond Accra and Kumasi as we know it. So that's how come the idea of SCCA came into being, and Red Clay, the idea of establishing something in a context that ordinarily you wouldn't think about, because as soon as you think about art, everyone starts thinking, oh, but the so-called most educated people are here, they understand art. At the end of the day, art is not really about that. It's not so much about anyone understanding it. Sometimes it also relies on a specific condition in order to produce an event, and maybe that event within the time that happens might not really be art at the time or at the moment. So the issue of the edge, for me, that's where that really came from. One, the dealing with it from maybe a pedagogical perspective of trying to expand the parameters of the thing you're trying to understand, and secondly also trying to include new voices and new spaces in such a way that it changes the very condition of art itself. So that's it.
Yeah. Okay. Wow. That's okay. Thank you very much. Let me try and bring it together. So for you, the question was, what is art on the edge for you? So for you, it's a spatial experience, creating conditions spatially outside of the tradition, and then seeing what happens in terms of event creation there. And on the edge, the interesting thing that happens on the edge is bringing in new voices, experimenting with alternatives, so to create alternatives outside of the traditional spaces of creation and exhibiting and being seen.
Exactly.
I have understood. Thank you very much. Wanlov, shall I call you Wanlov? Or
Yes.
Anything
Anything you want to right now.
Oh, wow.
Dripata would be cool.
I'll just call you Wanlov so everybody knows who I'm calling. What is art on the edge for you? Because you create in a significantly different way. What is it for you, and how does it overlap with or contrast with what Ibrahim has just described?
When I hear edge and art on the first thing that comes to my mind is a knife. Mm-hmm. And I feel that we are living in such a commercial, industrial time that, when I say industrial, I just mean like things are just being manufactured for us to consume, that most of us are turning into mindless zombies. And so arts on the edge are just creations that cause the mind to sharpen itself again and to cut through the mundane, to kill the zombies, basically. So things that are waking us up is what I think of when I hear Art on the Edge.
Nice. So I really like this metaphor of a knife. So really sharpening it and cutting through and, getting rid of zombies and waking us up to out of the mundane. So that's sort of a contrast and an overlap in how you each see what the edge is. I wonder for each of you, in what context, you've already alluded to this a little bit, but what is the context? Tell us a little bit more about the context in which art is necessary on the edge. So for Wanlov, for instance, what are these mundane things? What are the things that we should be waking ourselves up to? What are the things that this knife should be cutting through for us?
Something I've been addressing recently are colonial ghosts. I have begun to say, after realizing that most of us Ghanaians are actually colonial ghosts in black skin, and we are behaving exactly the same way as the colonial invaders behaved. And so Art on the Edge for me is releasing information that wakes us up to these things, to these realizations that we are perpetuating, the lifestyle or how we're perpetuating, the lifestyle that was in a way imposed upon us till now. Like when we build a house, we build it exactly like the Elmina slave forts. We build these huge walls with fence, barbed wire all around, when we didn't used to build like that. And so just the mere act of building a house or spreading information about better ways or more harmonious ways houses can be built may appear as just an art piece, a house you're building with like locally sourced material in an ergonomic way, but it's something that is opening people's minds up to a different way of being, and not just living to buy cement bags, cement blocks, and wood and roofing sheets and stuff like that. So there's a mini aspect. I can cover some hairstyles. We often talk about women perming their hair to look like the European standard of hair, but we don't. There's also this information that has reached me recently that the hairstyle that we call a boy, where our fathers and even some of our older brothers would put a parting in the side of their head, like shave a line there and part the hair like this, is exactly the way the Europeans used to comb their hair. The men, they would comb one side, like this side down and this side up. So that a boy style is not even an African hairstyle. So there are many petty things that I use my music and my visuals to just stimulate the minds of people, to sharpen it again, so they look out for these things and adjust accordingly.
But there is so you are looking to wake people up, but do you also propose alternatives in your work? Do you also say these are the problems, wake up, do it differently, or do you go further?
Yes, definitely. Like I said, we speak of other ways to build. We show examples of other ways that people are building with raffia, with clay, with other materials that are readily available to us. So, yeah, definitely. We are still doing research. As time goes, we are just researching and disseminating this information through our work.
And for you, Ibrahim Mahama, how is it for you in terms of the context in which you are trying to create alternatives? So for you, you are looking more at structures and forms and systems, and you built, as you mentioned just now, the SCCA, Red Clay, you're part of collectives. You and Wanlov both are trying to, you are both, I would propose, I would say proposing alternatives, right? Like waking people up, trying to do things differently. But can you describe the context within which this is happening?
Wanlov said something about the ghost. I have been exploring the idea of ghost in my work for some time now through the materials that I've been working with, like from the jute sacks, various characteristics which are somehow embedded within it, the aesthetical forms and how they speak to us. So in the beginning you said something about contrast with what he was talking about, the sharpening of the mind or somehow paying attention to the mundane, but it's not so much of a contrast because some of the work that we are doing is also somehow aiming towards that in a different way. For me, I think that ghosts are very important. I remember when we were children, almost every Ghanaian film had a ghost in it. Even if nothing had the ghost, it didn't have anything to do with the ghost. They always managed to put one ghost in the film somewhere. And it's interesting, they still do that. I think these days it's dinosaurs and things like that. But I like the idea of ghosts. Like when you take our history, post-independence, let's just focus on the post-independence aspects. You realize that there are so many buildings, infrastructure that we inherited from factories to silos and all that. And a lot of the work that I did from school, my school days, was going around some of these spaces, for instance, and collecting materials. So I would go and collect files from an old factory which was going to be burnt or destroyed because the land was being sold to a Chinese company. Or I would go to the railways and collect materials from there. The Parliament of Ghosts, which I produced in Manchester last year, was actually born out of that. The idea of taking these residues from our history as a starting point to somehow build a new space which uses the premises of the multiple truths that we've inherited within our history as a starting point for a renewed conversation. So it's very important that at least we're able to look at it within that sense. So for me, currently what I'm trying to do, one of the very important aspects of my work now is somehow intervening within old structures, like physically, like literally. So a couple of months ago, I negotiated with the state and I bought one of these old buildings that were built in the 60s by former Yugoslavian and also like Polish, Russian architects. And it's a building that you find dotted all around the country. And I've always, there was a project I did a couple of years ago titled The Exchanger. And at the time I was more interested in covering these buildings because I would take the jute sack and I was interested in the relationship between the material and the form that I was dealing with. But now, realizing that as an artist, there is a lot more to account for with regards to responsibility, blah, blah, blah. Like you suddenly realize that you can intervene within this space physically in such a way that if it was something which was built as a public institution which was somehow dying off, because most of these buildings were built towards the economic agenda program in the 60s. So since they were abandoned, they were never used afterwards. So now within our generation, how do we become time travelers of literally going back in time to somehow rescue some of these spaces and use them as almost like portals to somehow look at the future, to construct the future in a different way. Yeah, so it is, I'm trying to use the elements as, taking Wanlov's word, the ghost, trying to use the elements of the ghost as some kind of a teleportation device to understand what is yet to come.
So what in listening to you, I think a lot of what you are saying resonates with One Love, and what One Love says resonates with you. And what in between the lines, I kind of feel like, along with this theme of a ghost, which, you know, you are so right. All of us have been confronted with ghosts in films, like stories with families. My goodness, the fear of a Ghanaian child is not a small thing. But talking about edges, you know, someone once told me that if you want to create alternatives, you should start creating from the center, right? But it sounds like, actually, in this conversation, the past is an important aspect of art on the edge. So One Love, you spoke about, for instance, a boy, you know, we thought it was an African hairstyle, but actually, when we look back, it's so related to this ghost of the past, of like the influence of Europeans. The way we build now, we are building exclusive in the sense that we don't want people to enter our palaces, our forts. We are building forts for ourselves. So the tentacles of the past, the ghosts of the past are here with us. And Ibrahim, you also spoke about wonderful projects of, you know, buying up old architecture, covering them, looking for relationships between materials, you know, like the transactionality between materials and structures. And I wonder, what is the role of the past when we talk about the edge? Is the past the center from which you're trying to move away, or is the past actually the edge from which you're trying to create? Like, is the past one side of the knife, or is the past actually the center, like the tradition from which you are trying to get away from? Tell us more about the past.
Do you want me to go? Maybe One Love should start.
One Love, you can start, yeah.
The role the past plays in relation to the knife it's probably the most familiar cutting board we have. So we know, or we make our own cutting board. It's the one we can use without, you know, like maybe damaging the furniture or something. And it's like when we just take something as simple as pedestrian culture in Ghana, right? If you are crossing a T-junction as a pedestrian, you are crossing a junction that a car wants to turn into, and you're already in the middle of the road. By traffic regulations, the car is supposed to wait for you to finish crossing and then go. But another inherited colonial trait from when these important enslavers or invaders were riding around on horses or driving around in their cars, the locals or the natives would have to just scurry out of their way like cockroaches. And in the same way, when a car is turning into a junction, they just blow their horn at you and expect you to just fly into the sky or backtrack, because the car, that inherited value of a car being more valuable than an average human being in West Africa, is still present today. And so we have to explain these kind of psychologies to the youth for them to understand, and where this lack of respect comes in this transaction at this junction, you know. And so these are small things that I feel we can't move ahead in, because children want to know why, the youth want to know why. But why does this behave this way? Why does this move this way? You know, so that is what I see. That is how I see the past in relation to, you know, this edge. It's definitely necessary, a point from where to start. There's a healing process, and I feel like we need some kind of psychological or psychiatric overhaul to get rid of these colonial ghosts inside us. The value of Black life. Yeah, it has to be reevaluated.
That's a big call, you know, revaluing Black life and you know, really doing a deep psychiatric overhaul. So Ibrahim, Mr. Mahama, what would you like to say about this?
For me, the past, there is one thing that I always say that if we take Ghana, for instance, people are always saying that, but we are aiming towards we're aiming towards building a certain future. But when you also look at our history, you realize that in the 60s or post-independence era, with the attitude of the new African Nkrumah's development policies, blah, 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 the founding of the African Union and all the things that came with the hydroelectric dam, Tema, blah, 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 you realize that at the time, in terms of the ideas, ideological things that were at standpoint and things that we're working with, it was somehow unparalleled, like in the world. So, but a lot of these, of course, these forms were abandoned for till now. There are many things that we are trying to grapple with, which were like things that were coming from the 60s and late 50s. So when people say that, we have to build a future for our kids, I always think that maybe we have to somehow go back in the past and try as much as possible to resolve that which was there. So for me, the idea of the past, it's important to be able to go back into it, but it's a way also to somehow use it to unravel a certain future which we should. The problem is that we always try to act very sensible, like we always know what is yet to come, but you can't always predict what the future will be, but you just have to make sure that you're laying a right or a good foundation enough for it to manifest itself when the time comes. And I think that for me, the idea of the future on the edge and all that, I don't really look at it within that sense. I'm only looking at it as some kind of I'm only looking at the past as some kind of a potential which has a chance to somehow resolve or unravel certain things that we've been struggling to deal with or understand.
It's really interesting to listen to, because the conversation is in a sense taking an unexpected turn for me, but we're going to go with it. Because your reflections on the past make me, what I hear a little bit is that we have to build a past for our children, not a future, because we have to sort of make amends with things that happened in the past, and that there's a certain potential in building a past for our children or for ourselves, so that the future is secured, rather than just forgetting the past, which is the other thing that I find interesting in what you're saying. People often say the past is, forget about the past. You can't change anything about it, right? But actually what I'm hearing from both of you is that a large part of your work is about changing the past, because the past that we remember together, there's something there.
For me, it's not so much about changing the past. It's more or less like looking at maybe Einstein's relativity, like space-time continuum, looking at the past, the present, and future all in a single frame. So it's more or less about understanding the significance of things. So for instance, the reason why I started working with the jute sacks and many of the other objects that I did work with was that I didn't want to take things for granted, because that's the attitude of the 21st century man, or even the 20th century man, of thinking that the whole world revolves around them in a particular given time or point. But it's just that we don't have to forget that there are events that lead up to every moment that happens within time itself. So for instance, when people are consuming, I always make this analogy that, for instance, when cocoa beans, in the mid 20th century, Ghana was the highest producer of cocoa in the world, and we're producing so much cocoa that Nkrumah thought that by building these silos, we could store the cocoas and we could sell them at certain points where we could make more money out of them on the world market, blah, blah, blah. They were never completed, their silos. Then they brought in these jute sacks that were used in transporting these cocoa beans. But the jute sacks are only used to transport the cocoa beans just once. because you have to, because we don't have processing plants, which are the factories, the former cocoa food distribution corporation, which was never completed. So now the same thing, we have to buy the cocoa from the farmers quite cheap. We export it. The farmers don't really have enough. They don't really have enough to pay, let's say, people on the farms to help them. So at the end of the day, the out of, let's say, 100 and something billion that is made out of cocoa every year, and Ghana and Ivory Coast being majority producer makes, let's say, 3 point something billion. The excess capital, which comes in a form of aid coming back to us in NGOs and all that, they come back to tell the farmers, oh, you know, you don't have to use your children as child labor on the farms, blah blah blah. But it's that's the contradiction of capital, you know. It's the contradiction of capital contributes a lot to this. So someone who might be in America or somewhere else who is enjoying his maybe his chocolates every day, when he sees that there are issues regarding migration, maybe there are some Africans who are trying to cross over. Of course, that's another complicated subject. But when each time people revolt, like let's say the rise of the right wing and all that, people saying that, oh, but there are people who are coming in to take our jobs. And I said, do you know the cycle, the things that have happened when the World Bank and the IMF gives money and gives loans to these countries, the conditions that they come with, which has produced these aesthetics. So they're more or less like, it's very dense. It's very dense information. But I guess we as artists, we're only trying to deal with it from producing either objects, maybe producing, we get inspiration from it, maybe to produce music or to write. But at the end of the day, the question is also that how do we physically intervene within the system to make sure that we can somehow alter it in a different way? Yeah, so it's more or less about the shift. We are trying to just shift the lens in a different direction. Yeah, it's not like we can't change time or the past itself, but we can be more aware of it, and in being more aware of it, as Wanlov has said, like people being more aware of themselves and the histories that they've inherited, in that sense, we can somehow propose new futures.
Yeah. Okay, so you are putting it all together. You are not separating past, present, and future. You're looking more at like everything, the whole continuum of it.
Yes.
And trying to understand like the systems around that, rather than looking at center versus edge, past versus future, and all of that. Wanlov, did you want to speak to that?
No, I mean, yes. I like this idea of traveling to the past, or saying the past is actually our future, because a lot of unraveling needs to be done. However, I was having a small argument with a man here in Denmark this afternoon. He finished high school in 64 or 65 and left Ghana, has never been back. He lives in Denmark now. And he was talking about this uprising happening now. We're talking about what the youth need to do in Ghana. We're talking about the use of the music that I'm writing and that my peers are writing. And I was explaining to him that my music pointing out like corruption and malpractices and bad habits in Ghana is not saying anything new that the people don't already know. I need to evolve to the level where now I've acquired enough information and know-how on networks to make music that has more direction, more giving people more solutions than just pointing out the ills of the society. And one thing I learned from a few years ago in Ghana is that these rock bridges in Medina that had not been completed for about 5 years, maybe 10 years, were suddenly worked on quickly within a month or two when the youth blocked all the highway, Medina highway, with burning car tires and inconvenienced the elites in our society. And that is what is happening now in Nigeria. And the elites are being inconvenienced and they're beginning to answer to the requests of the youth. And so for me, and he was asking me, sorry, so he was asking me, but so what is the solution? And what is the solution? I said, well, Nkrumah has written a solution in over 30 books. Ayikwe Ama wrote the solution in Osiris Rising, where he says the African curriculum needs to be 75% Afrocentric, where Egyptian history is African history. It shouldn't be taught as a separate mystic kind of appearance that we don't know who built the pyramids. Africans built the pyramids. There are pyramids, more pyramids in Sudan than in Egypt. And so we need to create a new curriculum for the new generation, which makes them delete these colonial ghosts that they are inheriting or that are transferring themselves into their bodies via our syllabus, via our curriculum, via our consumerism. You go to Makola markets, 99% of the dollies and the toys there are white dolls, blonde hair, blue eyes. And so I am arming myself with the past, so that when I write something, be it consciously or unconsciously, I'm putting out a certain energy that continues to make youth inbox me and ask me, which book did you read? How did you get this information? What's going on? And slowly, all of them are gathering, information. And this is just something that's just popping in my head right now. But Independence Day, for me, when I look at it, for years and years, I didn't know what I found wrong about Independence Day. But a year or two ago, I realized that Independence Day in Ghana, 6 March, is us basically celebrating the fact that we were colonized. Like, hey, look, we were also colonized. Because if it's not a celebration of being colonized, we won't do exactly the same routines and marches and stuff that the British were doing, showing military might, making children stand in the sun and faint, making soldiers and so on suffer. Like, we would be doing a whole different celebration for independence, but we are actually celebrating the fact that we feel privileged that we were colonized. And so this is something too that needs to be unraveled in the minds of our youth. They shouldn't grow up looking at this as a way forward, because it is not. So yeah, the past plays a big role, for me, my research basically.
Yeah, no, I think this is really, really interesting to unpack the past, give the past a new meaning. So not necessarily changing the past, but re-understanding the past, and indeed really getting clued into, okay, so what exactly is it that we are doing when we celebrate independence? What is it that we are doing when we cut ourselves up? There's not essentially something wrong with the hairstyle. It's more like what... Just to understand where does it come from and how deep has the colonization been. I could talk about this forever, but I think, we said we are talking about art on edge. Yeah. And I wonder, what you are saying, especially you say, you found resonance, young people are listening to you and what you say resonates with them simply because they know. It's not that you are bringing something new to them when you talk about corruption. Everybody knows about corruption. You're looking for the next level where, you are together raising consciousness. As you are getting more conscious, everyone, the people who know you and follow you will gain this consciousness as well, and that's probably why you make yourself so accessible. What I wonder though is you both, the two of you, as big as your projects may be, you can't change everything alone. So I wonder, could you give us some reflections on the creative scene in Ghana and the potential you see there in retelling stories of the past and creating alternatives and getting people to the edge? And when you're answering this, I also want to know from you, if there was an edge, should we be going over the edge or just skirting that edge? Is it a fine line we should skirt along, or should we be trying to get ourselves to jump off the edge and if we are to jump, where are we going to? It's a lot of questions in one, but because I want you guys to just talk a lot. And then we can start with Ibrahim.
Why do you want me to start first? Okay, yeah. That was a long question, though. Yeah, I'll try and give a very simple.
So first,
yeah,
the first
short-
part was about the creative scene,
Yes.
and then about the edge. What are we supposed? If there was an edge, what are we trying to do with this edge?
Yeah, I think that the art scene or the creative scene is is developing quite a lot. At least there are more artists who are experimenting now than there was historically. So that is a very good thing for us within our creative scene. And I think also now there are more collaborations than there were before. As I said in the beginning, there are more collectives now, artists coming together to work together. Trying to understand what their fellow artists are doing and trying to see how they can help to somehow unravel certain things. So for instance, two of my colleagues, Dr. Akwe Jackson and Kwesi Oheniaye, for many years, from 2014 to 17, we worked on a series of publications, texts, maybe on mostly on some of the projects that I was working on, which led to certain publications. They are also part of the Black Star Lines collectives. They've curated a lot of the exhibitions that have happened at the museum, which happened between 2015 and then 17. When we did the first exhibition at SCCA last year with Kofi Dawson, it was Bernard Akwe Jackson who curated that show. And then the recent exhibition, which we did with Ajiman Osei, Ekutia, and the poetics of, I've forgotten, Kwesi will kill me. Blindfolding the Sun and the poetics of peace. Yes.
Blindfolding the Sun.
Yes, Blindfolding the Sun and the poetics of peace. Yes. So he curated that exhibition. So the point I'm trying to make is that now they are artists. So for instance, they are both artists, but they are very much, and he curated it with Tracy Thompson and Ajuamwa, who are also both artists. But the point is that now you find more artists, younger artists, who are interested even in the older generation with regards to work that they've done. Sometimes I get a bit worried, for when you look in music, sometimes some of the artists make comments like, we are making much better music and surviving off music better now than the before because the older guys didn't make any money and blah blah blah. Yeah, sometimes I think they're just irresponsible statements. But when young people come together to somehow understand that they've inherited something, we're coming back to this history thing again. That maybe for a long time there wasn't enough room, enough playing field. So maybe what their predecessors couldn't do, now they have the opportunity to do that. So for instance, I always say that if we didn't have people like Dr. Caricature within our generation to guide and lead us, or people like Bernard Akwe Jackson, who has been a mentor to us, a lot of us maybe wouldn't have thought that it's necessary to practice as an artist because there wasn't so much, if you were just looking at what we so for me, I think it's very, very important somehow to be able to, the issue of the edge, I don't think it's unless jumping over or something.
We should over.
No, we also want to understand what the center and the space in between, but also maybe there is something beyond the edge. After all, even in there are a lot of scientists who believe that we are living in a multiverse. So maybe at the edge of the universe, maybe there's a possibility of escaping that and going into another dimension. So who knows? There are endless possibilities, and I like to keep such that sometimes let's just keep something. And then maybe what it produces, we will then take it from there.
We'll see from, okay, all right. Thank you. So, I mean, you see more collaboration. Do you see this happening as well in the music scene? Do you see how do you see the creative scene, and how does it relate to the edge for you?
Before I get to that, I mean, to me, Ibrahim Mahama has gone over the edge several times. Like, when I first saw his work, I was like, this guy is crazy. And to me, going over the edge.
Ibrahim Mahama crazy.
Yeah, like when I saw the National Theatre covered, or I saw the buildings in Legon or King University campus covered, I was like, this guy is crazy. So that reaction for me is someone who has gone over, maybe it was my edge, maybe I had set a certain edge, and he has crossed it several times already. And I feel like if we don't cross edges, I feel edges in this sense are boundaries and borders that have been set on us. So being on the edge is a way of eating away at these boundaries and these borders. And unless we do that, we can't show other people how to get free and to take things to another level. I think edges are constantly being pushed back farther and farther. And collaborative setups or settings in the music scene. I feel there are a lot of like-minded, conscious artists right now creating stuff. I won't say we're necessarily working collectively in a network or an organized sense, but I think we are working together in a spiritual sense. I mean, there's an artist like Adoma who is writing a lot about self-love, black love. There's also Ria Boss, who is also covering these topics. And there are artists that are also representing, like the LGBT movement more in their visuals, in their videos, in a sense, in their topics. And so I feel there is a kind of psychic collaboration going on, because we are all doing music or writing, creating text or energies meant to question or to liberate the youth or to expand our horizons and our minds. So it's quite organic. I feel forced. I'm not a planner. I wish I was, and maybe I wish I wasn't. But I feel this is more mystical, and so it is going on. I am seeing a lot of young artists and even older artists which have started changing their subject matter. A lot of artists are becoming very aware of spaces around the human body. There used to be artists that would say anything, like they would say misogynistic stuff in their lyrics and so on. And now all these things are being kept and being straightened out, and people are becoming more nurturing in their approach, at least in my networks and so on. So it's a good look.
Yeah. Okay, so you're both quite positive about the creative scene. Mm-hmm. So Ibrahim Mahama, what do you, because at Wanlov now, he just got up and said he was wondering if you're a madman, and because he thinks you've pushed the edge, right? You've gone over the edge with your work. Do you see yourself as somebody? Well, obviously you don't, because you already said you don't believe in the edge. There is no edge, which is what happens when you've gone over the edge. Idea of the multiverse. But how do you see someone like Wanlov and the idea he's proposing of the edge? Because he's saying actually edges are boundaries, and crossing those boundaries might be what we need. But your experience of the creative scene and collaboration in the creative scene is more mystical. So I wonder, Ibrahim, can you speak to what he's saying, like in terms of going over the edge and how you see his work? Oh, Ibrahim is in outer space, so the sound has gone off.
They gave Ibrahim. Okay, this one is Obed. You are support.
Yeah, you calling
I'm
him
gonna
out.
hold Obed. You are support to this for giving Ibrahim a batteryless mic.
They have called your name, oh, it wasn't me.
Sorry, I think it wasn't
I can hear
on.
you.
Yeah. No, I agree. It's interesting to hear Wanlov say that I'm crazy because everyone knows that he's the one who is crazy.
All of it is meant with love.
Yes, exactly.
Well, I'm here actually with someone who also thinks you are crazy. But I'm not the only one.
No, but
She said I should say hello, by the way.
okay, hello to them. So yeah, no, I agree with what he's talking about, the edge, knowing what it is and pushing it. I give an example. Part of the work that we were trying to do in Tamale was we were trying to focus the project, like the whole exhibition experience, and convert it into workshops and things like that. Last 2 years, I became heavily interested in this idea of purchasing these old aircrafts in Accra and taking them to the north. So, of course, it took quite a process, but we were able to. There were 5 of them, and then there was one in Tamale, so 6 of them, and we literally had to like dismantle them and transport them from Accra all the way to Tamale. It was an entire project, but that was not my focus. My focus was what these things were going to become once they were in Tamale. One of the first workshops that we did was with Kofi Dawson, out of the exhibition that had been curated by Bernard Akwe Jackson. But my idea was that could it be possible, instead of doing some of these workshops in like within the institutional context, can we use the interior of the airplanes as like learning spaces or classrooms? In my work, I have used drones a lot in photographing buildings and the projects I've done. So one of our colleagues at the center, Sakite, I was teaching him how to operate these drones. So in turn, he started teaching these kids in the community. And there's one particular kid, Latif, who somehow he's been studying quite a lot with Sakite. So now he understands the drone tech, like in terms of how the drone operates and all that, that he can teach his contemporaries how to fly the drone in Dagbani. Like, I cannot teach in Dagbani, but he now understands it in a way that he can teach in Dagbani. And moreover, being able to push the boundary and moving from, let's say, doing a lot of these kids, I'm not trying to patronize them or anything, but just the reality is that most of these people who live in these communities, they would have maybe never seen an airplane to begin with, to talk about now having it as a reality within the community, because Red Clay is in a rural setting that they can feel, touch, play around with, have classes within it, and even play within the cockpit, which all of us, even those people who pay the most expensive business class tickets, they never go to the cockpit, no matter how much you pay. So the idea of somehow, it's almost like it's breaking the wall in a way, you know. So that for me, it somehow goes into what Wanlov is talking about in terms of pushing the edge. And when we are doing these things, it's not so much to somehow reflect on what we think or how we are experiencing art, but we are trying to create a premise under which which maybe the generation that is growing up, their understanding of art and the culture around it, and also other cultural norms, will be very different in the way that they will anticipate the future, which is yet to come. Yeah, so in that way, you are somehow pushing the edge very much. Some of like the early projects I did, which was covering the buildings, I think I pushed quite a lot of things, but for me it was still they were experiments in a way. And when I do those projects, they are still very much experimental in a sense, but being able to create work that somehow influences a certain attitude, which you yourself, you're only someone like, it's almost like a catalyst. You are trying to create something, but you yourself, it's not part of your lived condition. You're trying to create it in such a way that maybe a generation of minds that is yet to come up, they will grow up thinking differently about the world. Because honestly, all these problems that we are having, both in Ghana and in the world, all these nonsensical things that are happening, it's all because of the way the brain functions, and education, and how people respond to the world and how they consume information. So if we can create we can create new constellations, maybe those constellations will change the way that the world functions in the time to come. So that is some in relation to what Wanlov is saying. So I do agree with him, but just that from my position as an artist, I have a very different position as to the kind of constellations that I create within a given system and time.
Yeah. You know, both of you take on a lot in terms of what you're trying to do. You know, you are really trying to reassess, reevaluate systems, also trying to create alternative futures, really weighing what has been, and trying to anticipate indeed what might be if you would do things differently, if you would arrange the building blocks of our societies differently, if you would arrange the building blocks of our minds differently. What would it mean? You're asking yourself essential, fundamental questions, but your projects also sound like megalomaniac projects. They're big projects. You are getting thousands of people, maybe millions of people. You're traveling all around the world, both of you traveling all around the world, doing big things and asking big questions, and maybe also moving large amounts of resources around that also shape how you are seen, how people see you, how people accept you. And I wonder, you know, it's kind of a funny story since Wanlov doesn't wear shoes, but how do you keep your feet on the ground? How do you stay grounded? Wanlov, it's not a joke, it's a real question. Like, how do you stay down to earth? Because in this world of ideas, we spent almost an hour now talking about the world of ideas. Our brains have been invited into outer space with both of you, but how do you keep your feet on the ground? How do you stay focused on what you're trying to achieve and not allow yourself to just lift off?
Where would we go if we lift off? What do you have an idea?
But I mean, isn't this well, okay? So the assumption is that
just go mad. Is that what you mean? Like,
no, I mean, madness is not the only option. You know, okay. Arrogance is an option. I mean, that's some of the sort of top-down leadership that we've seen. People who really feel like, you know, just to call. Unfortunately, I don't like to say his name, but Donald Trump would be the example of somebody who has taken on something very big and is not related to the world at all anymore. You know, he's like. So I mean, yes, he's a madman, but he's not simply a madman. He's just somebody who's not connected anymore to the ground. And let's say 200,000 people who have died from COVID. You know, whatever, be brave. You can fight. Don't be afraid of COVID. You know, this type of, that's what I mean by becoming too far away.
I guess for me, it's my empathy. I have been a victim of the energy of arrogance, and I do not wish to harness that energy and disseminate it to anybody. And so that's just it for me. I have a low battery. So yeah, it's just a low battery warning, but I'll be fine. So it's just it for me. And where I get my energy from is from the hoping, from the people around me on the ground, just like real human beings with just regular real problems. And so I don't know how to like expound on that, but maybe I can also say I wasn't brought up that way, to be arrogant. And so that's just it for me. And I really believe that we can create a different reality for ourselves, because I've seen this at micro levels in different parts of the world I've been to. I mean, let's just leave it at that. In different parts of the world, there are small communities here and there that exist without aspiring to show off their latest phone or car or clothes or something to their neighbor. They're just actually there hoping their neighbor comes to ask them for some sugar or something, just to interact and exchange like energy, and not on a level they're not aspiring to be well off, far better off than their neighbor, because they understand what community means. And I feel like my energy is just that. It's like I'm just trying to create a reality for myself, my people around me, and possibly or hopefully it spreads to where we're just looking out for each other and not trying to make somebody feel some other way around us.
Yeah. But okay, so empathy really helps you keep your feet on the ground, and also a focus on this alternative. So your aspirations, you keep your aspirations very different in check. You keep your aspirations in check so that you create positive energy around yourself, and that's how you keep your feet on the ground. More or less.
Yes. No.
More or less. Okay. How would you like to answer this question, Ibrahim? How do you keep your feet on the ground when you're working on these large
I guess it's
projects?
It comes down to community and also exercising responsibility. I guess for a lot of us, sometimes we forget exactly why we're doing what we're doing. A lot has happened in history to afford us the moments that we live in. So at every point in time, whatever we're doing, we have to remind ourselves that we are also somehow contributors to the legacy of time in itself. So the issue of arrogance or those things don't even begin to set in, because you realize that there are so many people. For instance, the recent exhibition we did in Tamale, we had so many artists from Kumasi, younger artists who came to live in Tamale to work on the exhibition for more than a month. It's not as if we're paying them for it, but the idea that people would, everyone has something very important to do at any given time, but the fact that someone will leave whatever they're doing to sacrifice their time, energy for a certain cause, of course, maybe you are just facilitating it and all that, but you realize that there are so many people whose lives and also whose futures depend on some of these things, because whatever we are building, we always have to remind ourselves that it's part of a much larger community, and there is a lot more at stake within that. So we somehow have to keep our heads low, in a way that we are part of a larger narrative. So at least you don't get disconnected from what you're doing. Once you get disconnected, then there becomes a problem. So I think that that is just it. The idea of responsibility, exercising responsibility.
Okay, so we have empathy. It helps to keep you.
This summarization.
No, I think it's important, because I think
it's good.
shared are quite complex, so that's why I try to get us back. This is what we are saying.
It's good.
You like it?
Yeah.
You want to laugh at me, small right?
No.
No, but so because I think this is important, because empathy is something that I don't find a lot of people talking about in Ghana. Actually, I think that a lot of people's aspirations are a repetition of historical aspirations that have led to gross inequalities in our societies. So empathy is an interesting thing to bring up, and this idea of responsibility and the idea of connection, like staying connected to communities, is I think very important, and thank you so much for sharing these things in such humane ways. Because both of you are connected to interesting, aspirational, creative communities. I'm wondering, like, if I would ask you to invite emerging artists or invite contemporary artists to do something, so not to an event but to do something, what would you invite them to do? What would you invite them to join you on the edge? Would you what would you actually, at this point, since connection is so important for your groundedness, what would you invite young, emerging, aspiring artists around you to do? The question is hard, and both of you are looking like you're thinking it.
Yeah, we are thinking. We have to use the brains.
Ibrahim said, no, this is not a challenge. He has an answer already.
Okay.
At all. No, I guess it's just taking risk, taking more risk.
Taking risk.
Yeah, taking more risk. I guess, a lot of people don't want to take any risk because they're always so certain about themselves and the time, and everything is so precisely calculated. But we have to risk, and we have to dream, we have to fantasize those things. Like, we need more of that within this generation.
Okay, so you want people to take more risks?
Yes.
Okay, I just got a message, but yes, I think the invitation to take more risks is a really good invitation. I think even me, the big risk taker, I can take more risks.
Yeah, I often have artists, especially rappers, some singers and some poets, come and hang out with me in different parts of Accra, depending on if I'm close to the neighborhood or it's like and in these places, let's say at Teshi First Junction, in the midst of different traders, food sellers, fruits, we just do spontaneous performances, like maybe I'll be playing my kushka and an artist will be rapping. And this opens a world to the artists and to the onlookers, which has been closed for some time. You don't see, the only people you see basking in our cities, be it Kumasi, Accra, Tamale, here and there, are religious people. You just see the religious people using megaphones and stuff. You don't see artists who also have societal messages or funny messages or nice sounding messages to uplift people. People are just left with religious options. And so doing this encourages people to be open to these kind of possibilities and options, to look out for them, to support them, and artists that do these kind of performances are encouraged to carry on in different parts and invite other artists with them to do this in different parts of the country. And we are trying to push back into this basking, like to this way of just picking a junction one day a week somewhere, Circle, Takrady, Pramado Junction, Bongo in Upper East Region, and just performing to just people at a junction they're selling or just hanging out, not with microphones, speakers, anything, just communal. And I feel it's the strongest connection than anything, than being on stage, than being on TV, than then downloading your MP3 or whatever. That is the most direct connection we can have. And it makes artists realize their power, and it brings people together as well. And so these are like experiments that we do with artists we work with.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much. I think it fits perfectly with Ibrahim's invitation to take more risks. So take more risks. For example, go busking so that you can have a direct connection to.
Because it's frowned upon by our classist society. Like, oh, they put basking next to begging. You know, we think like the only people who bask are people who are begging for money. But yeah, and so I'm trying to also like reset that way of thinking, because a lot of us are like, me, I should stand by the road and be performing. I'm a star, I'm a star.
Okay, I just got a message from Elizabeth saying there are questions in the audience. Are there any questions in the audience at this point? Because I see we're over time.
Oh, really? Sorry.
We started a little bit late. That's why I thought we would be fine with time. But if there are questions, then we would end up very significantly over time. Ibrahim, we're not there, so I can't tell if there are questions in the audience. You see anybody in the audience
I don't know.
wanting to ask a question?
Hello? Can you hear me?
He's not minding them.
He's not minding it.
So,
There's a question coming.
okay, so I have to read a few comments from social media, then I'll get to the question. So we have one from Facebook, and this is Muhammad Ali. He's a writer, Ghanaian writer, and he says, great discussion, watching from New York City and enjoying this. And then we have on Instagram a question, a comment from Omon Blanks, and he says, they are both being modest because they constantly push the edge with their work. They are both crazy. And yeah, okay, so those are the comments. So now we can take how many questions do we have? Okay, for now we have one question. So
One question, all right.
First of all, craziness is all right.
Hey, don't spell the mic.
Yes, I was saying craziness is all right, so long as we later on reconcile it with where we are coming from. You go off the edge, but like somebody who's jumping on a trampoline, you must come down to earth in the end. But the experience of going off the edge enables you to see where you've gone wrong. So I have no objection to trying new things and taking new risks. The question is anything different normally better? So how do we evaluate the new things we do to make sure they are life-supporting?
Wanlov.
Well, the new things really come about because the old things, again, like we said, are either becoming boring to us, because as human beings we are wired to get bored of routine, of mundane behavior. So we try new things to see what new energies or avenues it opens. And if it works or if it's better, then we maintain and pursue till we get bored of those things. And so it's just, I guess, it's just wired in our nature to have certain people within the population explore and come back and give the gospel.
Yeah, and I also think that the new also allows for the inclusion of new voices, because if we are just stuck with older forms, we're living in a technological age. There are a lot of children now, or kids now, who maybe might be more interested in experimenting with computing forms than maybe painting on a canvas, or maybe they are interested in maybe electronic music than maybe jazz or something. But we have to make room for all of these things. So at least one of those things that we can, I think Wanlov was talking about the idea of the risk-taking aspect, which I was talking about, like going to certain spaces to perform, which ordinarily an artist wouldn't go because it didn't somehow fit within what it meant to be an artist who is a star. But what does it really mean that an artist is a star or whatever? I, as an artist, dedicating all my resources into building these spaces in Tamale at the end of the day, and maybe being a teacher at the same time with other colleagues and working with other colleagues, what does it really mean? If I had probably made up the decision that, or maybe I would try and live in maybe one of the best places countries where artists normally like to go and live, maybe in Switzerland or things like that, we wouldn't have some of these conversations that are happening. And I think that it's very important that at least within every generation, there is a shift. There is some kind of a shift from what was before, or growth from what was before. So I'm very careful to say that for us, sometimes there's a tendency that people think that the newer generation somehow want to erase the old, but there is nothing such as that. We're not trying to erase. We're only trying to propose new forms which somehow give a new generation a different standpoint in terms of how they can make contributions to their field. That's all.
Yeah, thank you both for this. I think I would like to wrap up now, if that's okay. Ibrahim, does it look like it's okay in the room for me to wrap up?
I think so. There are no questions.
Yeah, there's a comment, there's a question actually on YouTube, and I think it goes to both Wanlov and Ibrahim, and the question is from Kwame Taylor, and he's asking, how do you both balance using the past and striving for organic development? So I think this will be our last question, and then we can unfortunately end this session.
Wanlov, they said, how do you use the past? Organic development.
I think they logged into YouTube a bit late. I think we kind of said earlier that in research in the past, we realized that a lot of our current practices are quite synthetic, they are quite schizophrenic. Like just a simple act of using cement blocks and cement mortar to build a square room is a very violent act you can do to yourself, because the reverb that occurs in that room is so harsh compared to a mud house built in a circle, which according to like the organic design is self-cooling, and it just embraces you, and there's absorption of sound waves to where there's not this bouncing and reflection of sound, which you don't even know. If you walk into an empty cement house and you're just speaking in rooms, that echo and that reverb you're hearing is very unsettling. You can only get rid of it by filling the house with a lot of materials. And so just that alone is something we can address as something we've been doing till now, that we need to look at to have an organic or a more ergonomic future. So this is just one aspect, but there's many ways you can do that, and it's very possible, and it's happening now.
But sometimes we also need to build with cement, because there are certain experiences that can only happen within that context, and maybe
so as an experiment, or
no, not really as an experiment, because if you look at let's say 20th century thinking, of course there's quite a lot of problem with let's say, some of the architecture with regards to building with materials like cement and all that. But at the same time, it allows for certain forms to be born which ordinarily wouldn't have been born. So, for instance, if we are going to reduce, let's say, artistic or aesthetical or structural forms, let's say, to the traditional architecture of using clay, then there are some forms that you cannot. Of course, an example of how these two things also work is that in Tamale, one of the spaces is built with cement and the other space is built with bricks, which is clay.
Bricks,
So there are two different things, but they somehow, the architecture is structured in such a way that they both can do the same thing. So that's the issue of time which I was talking about. So that's why it's important for me to go back and buy the concrete silo, because the concrete silo, in as much as it's problematic with regards to how it was architecturally, with regards to pouring this amount of concrete, but it also produces a certain phenomenon with regards to how, like, what it does in the concept of the void, and even when you're thinking about it in relation to sound and also other ecological things, it gives you. So for me, I don't like, it's not a dichotomy in a way. So I'm trying to look at it, just see what it presents. Sometimes in a historical sense, it might be very brutal, but when you open it up and you just look at it in a new light, it presents certain potentials that ordinarily, maybe within a more just direct ecological sense, it wouldn't make sense. But we try to balance it.
We understand.
Well, I think we are well over time, which is always a sign of a good conversation. So thank you both for allowing me to summarize everything that you've said, and also for engaging and indulging in this conversation, because it's been really great. And I think Omon Blanks is right. You are both very modest in the work that you do and your talents and what you bring and who you bring together. Oh, sorry, small compliment I'll give you to you. Are looking cross-eyed.
It's my normal look.
It's my normal look. But in terms of art on the edge, I think that we started out defining the edge, then saying, in fact, there is no edge. And then we went back to saying, actually, we want to push edges. Both of you, there's a method in your madness. You might seem a bit crazy, because who walks around making music on the streets? Who, takes a whole bunch of airplanes to Tamale from Accra on the road? I mean, who raps the National Theatre in old jute sacks? There is some madness there, but in that madness, the madness is not what we as a society have understood as madness. And in that sense, it takes us back to the need for a psychiatric overhaul, because there are certain things that we call mad that are in fact not mad at all. It's people researching, people remembering, people redefining, people dealing with ghosts and finding themselves in these processes of dealing with ghosts and building communities. So I want to thank you both.
Wow, what a summary. This was excellent summary.
It was it?
I'm not a writer.
Because I'm sitting here with two ripers. But thank you so much for joining us in this conversation. Thank you, Peja, for bringing us together. Thank you for producing the space in your literary festival to talk about art on the edge, because I think this conversation is cross-cutting. When we think of literary, we maybe only think of books, but again, we have to push boundaries, and I hope that this was a good contribution to continuing to push those boundaries to create something better for you and for me and everybody. I didn't even say that. Thanks very much.
Thanks, guys. Thank you.
Ibrahim Mahama, thanks. Wanlov the Kubolor.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Thank you, Obed.
Thank you, Obed. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Goethe Institute. Thank you, audience, both online and offline. Thank you, and a round of applause for all.
Oh, yeah, that was loud. I didn't know that.